It's wonderful to see you all. Thank you for joining us on this Thursday afternoon/evening. This is Teaching COP26 and Indigenous Activism in the Classroom. My name is Emmy Tither. I'm the K-12 Education Program Coordinator at the LAII, and I'm also joined by Jasmine Morris and Whitney Wagner, who are graduate assistants with the education program. We will also be joined by Dr. Andreas Hernandez a little bit later on. He's just finishing up some teaching and he will be joining us shortly. So while we wait for him to join us, let's introduce ourselves. We're kind of a small group at the moment, which is lovely, so we can get to know each other. If you don't mind, if you could please introduce yourself. Originally, this was a breakout room activity. However, there aren't that many of us here, so we can do it, we can do it organically. You feel free to either unmute yourself and introduce yourself, or put your information in the chat box. Name, where you teach, and what drew you to this workshop. Maria, go for it.
Excellent. Amy, thank you so much. My name is Maria Sheldon. I teach U.S. history in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Can you hear me?
You're breaking up a little bit. Your connection is a bit slow. But I hear that you teach history in Santa Fe.
Okay.
Oh.
A little bit. I'll type it on the side.
Oh dear Maria, I think we can't really understand you. Okay, thank you so much for putting it in the chat box. Thank you. As Jasmine says, if it helps to turn off your camera, that may help with the connection issues. But thank you so much for being here, Maria. It's wonderful to have you here. Holly or Valerie, thank you very much for being here. We'd love to know kind of where you teach and what drew you to this workshop.
I'll go ahead and go. I am not a current teacher, but I wrote a book on environmental justice in New Mexico. And so I'm interested in getting the content of the book and having children just learn a little bit more in school. So that's why I'm here, to hear your approaches and what to do next. Thanks for having us. Holly?
Sure. I'm Holly Harden. I live in Durham, North Carolina. I teach 7th and 8th grade math and science, and teaching about climate is something that is probably like my favorite subject to teach on. I've done a lot of work with folks at Rethinking Schools and the Zen Education Project, some stuff with Naomi Klein about teaching climate, but I'm always looking for more and new ways and like what's current. So I was really excited to see this being offered.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here, all of you. Valerie, thank you so much for sharing your book as well. I've written down the fact that you've written a book, and I will definitely be checking it out afterwards. And Holly, would be wonderful to have your perspective in teaching climate too. So thank you, all of you, for being here. Now, we've put together, and I say we, the LAII, we've put together 3 lesson plans particularly on COP26 and Indigenous activism surrounding COP26. So while we wait for Dr. Andreas to get here and to finish teaching, I will pass it over to Jasmine, who will give an overview on 2 of these lesson plans, and then Dr. Hernandez will have his presentation, and then we will discuss the final lesson plan. So I'll let Jasmine take it away.
Thanks, Emmy. Thanks everyone for being here. I love that we have a small group of kind of diverse backgrounds. I think it's going to be fun. So like Emmy said, I'm a graduate assistant with the Latin American and Iberian Institute K through 12 outreach program. And the LAII is committed to expanding awareness, knowledge, understanding of Latin America and Iberia among diverse constituents. I haven't memorized that yet, Whitney. As part of that commitment, the LAII strives to create a stimulating and supportive environment for K through 12 educators so that they can produce, enhance, and expand knowledge of Latin America within their classrooms. To this end, we work with educators across grade levels and subject areas, providing them with the following resources: professional development workshops like the one we're all in right now. We have a book group and a blog called Vamos a Leer. We provide curriculum, local lending resources, and youth events. So the workshop today, we're going to start with an introduction to COP26, and then I'll go over the lesson plan that we have created called What is COP26 for high school, middle school to high school students. I will then go over the podcast lesson about COP26, and then we'll have a presentation by Dr. Andres Hernandez, who's gonna kind of give us a little bit of foundational information about how the UN works. And then we'll open it up for a discussion. And then Emmy's gonna take us over the media literacy lesson plan, and then we'll have time for questions and comments. Okay, so what is COP26? I know that we heard a lot about it last year in October and November when it was happening and kind of right after, but I didn't really know what COP26 is, what it meant. I had never heard about it before. So the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, COP26, brought together 120 world leaders and over 40,000 registered participants, including 22,274 party delegates, 14,124 observers, and 3,886 media representatives. For 2 weeks, the world was riveted on all facets of climate change: the science, the solutions, the political will to act, and clear indications of action. The outcomes of COP26, the Glasgow Climate Pact, is the fruit of intense negotiations among almost 200 countries over the 2 weeks, strenuous formal and informal work over many months, and constant engagement both in person and virtually for nearly 2 years. The approved texts are a compromise, said UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. They reflect the interests, the conditions, the contradictions, and the state of political will in the world today. They take important steps, but unfortunately, the collective political will was not enough to overcome some deep contradictions. So now that we kind of have a little reference to what COP26 is, we've created a lesson plan for students, as I mentioned earlier, that kind of introduces the topic and then lets them do a simulation activity of negotiations between world leaders and climate witnesses. So the lesson, this is just kind of the highlights of the lesson plan, but you'll, in the resource packet for this workshop, you'll have like access to the whole thing. It's a lot longer. I believe it's a 90-minute class lesson plan where students will have some reference material that they will go over before class to have some foundational information to jump off of once they come to class. And then you'll go over that with students and have some discussion and answer any questions and clarify any things that they may have been confused about from the readings. And then students will research one of 4 Latin American countries. And this can be adjusted to anywhere in the world, but because we're the Latin American and Iberian Institute, we focus our lesson plans on Latin America. So the countries that we have put in the lesson plan are Honduras, Ecuador, Guatemala, or Mexico. So the class will be split into 4 groups. Each group will be assigned one of those countries, and they will work together to identify crucial climate issues affecting their countries that they will present to class in the form of a country profile. And the class will act as world leaders, and the groups presenting will be climate witnesses. So climate witnesses are specialists in a particular area of concern regarding climate change. Their responsibilities include presenting information and recommendations to guide world leaders in making the necessary decisions to address issue areas. And while they're presenting, like I said, the whole class will act as world leaders. World leaders have the authority and responsibility to make the necessary decisions that will ultimately generate the change needed to protect the planet against global warming. They represent individual countries and must work together to implement strategies to address the concerns of climate witnesses. So this will allow students to kind of engage in the discussion and collaboration that's like the backbone of a COP conference. And so this is the second lesson plan in our resource guide. And it is a podcast lesson plan on the Guardians Today in Focus podcast, episode COP26, Where Does the World Go From Here? So the essential questions in this lesson plan are: how successful was COP26? Who were the winners and losers? And what areas still need attention? And what new issues have arisen since COP26 that should be addressed at COP27? So the idea for this one is to provide a lesson plan for students that's focus on the aftermath of COP26, so they can kind of evaluate for themselves and engage with media on what the narrative is after the fact. So as part of this lesson, students will listen to the podcast focusing on the key points presented in that episode of cash, coal, cars, and trees. So they will consider these 4 areas as they apply to Latin America. And they will focus on a country and then do a profile of each country and how these areas affect that country and changes that need to be made. In a closing exercise, students will have the opportunity to read an article addressing Indigenous concerns about climate change and reflect on how the narrative changes depending on whose perspective is centered. So that's kind of like a closing thought exercise that students will do at the end of this lesson plan. Okay. Emmy, you want to explain these?
Yeah, awesome. We'll be sending through this PowerPoint after the presentation is over, but we've included 2 videos that we thought would kind of give a good background information both to you if needed, and also to your students. Now, this video regarding kind of COP26 according to a kid is definitely made with kind of younger students in mind. However, definitely applicable to kind of the middle and higher classrooms. It's quite cute. It's made by the Glasgow Science Centre and kind of forms a kind of gentle introduction to what is COP26 and what is its importance. Next slide, please. And this video, I'm hoping we'll have time to watch in full because it is particularly affecting. Now, this is, as it says kind of on the screen, Indigenous people should lead the way. And this was a presentation given by an Indigenous activist at COP26 itself. Now, of course, we're Latin American and Iberian Institute, and our focus is on Latin America. However, this speech really speaks to kind of the importance of collaboration and also to listening to each other and kind of speaking to the people at the COP26 delegation and asking them, well, we'll see it in a second, but asking them to kind of take Indigenous people's knowledge and ways of interacting with the world very much into account. So as we wait for Dr. Hernandez to join us, we will have a chance to watch this. I know Whitney will need to stop sharing and reshare. We'll have some discussion questions when this finishes. Oh, and Valerie, thank you very much for putting those links in the chat box. ArcGIS story maps are amazing. And I look forward to seeing those. So no, thank you. That's wonderful. Whitney, take it away.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, I am happy to be here today as an Indigenous woman that consider forest and land as home, not as commodities. And I am very glad that this climate negotiation have started to consider that nature and forests have a key role to play in the meeting the objective of the Paris Agreement. It took you 25 COPs to understand that indigenous peoples have known forever our planet is alive. Soil are her skin. Forests are her hair. Rivers are her blood. And today, the earth is sick, probably dying. Today, at this special event, indigenous peoples bring something special to the table, our solution. Some government and company, including in this room, are responsible for the deforestation and land stealing in many areas. And while some are expert on deforestation, we, indigenous peoples, have a PhD in reforestation and sustainable management of land. Even we represent only 5% of the world's population. We protect 80% of the remaining biodiversity. We repair the forests, even when climate causes dramatic forest fire. In the Sahel, my people are the best architects of the Great Green Wall that avoid desertification and restore land degradation. We do this as a duty, not as a job, because we must protect the forest and land that give us all what we want: food, medicine, knowledge, and so on. We use our indigenous people's traditional knowledge as a tool to protect nature. We don't stand in front of you as a victim. No. Today, we stand as climate champion. Indigenous peoples are already have a neutral way of living in this planet. So, I come to this leaders event on forest and land with a very simple message. We have the map. We know where we are going, and we know how to drive. So give us the key. First, we celebrate the announcement of the dedicated initial $1.7 billion to implement indigenous-led solution. Yes, help is coming, and we celebrate the beginning of this process of ground action. Congratulations. Paris committed, and Glasgow is delivering. Second, support us also by ensuring the full respect of our rights to land, territories, and resources. This is true for government, but also for companies. There is no value in making beautiful speech here about deforestation if at home you let the private sector steal indigenous people's land or destroy the ecosystem. Finally, it is great to see world leaders, as just we hear here, committed to protect forests and land. But you will not be able to do this in the offices. We, as the guardian of the forest, are the best, we are also the best bankers to manage this amazing investment. And to do so, we need to work together as a partners, not as beneficiaries. And we all know partners work together and sit together to take the decision. Excellencies, in 10 days, I will go back home, and nothing will change yet. So the next months will be critical to implement the commitment that have been made today. And in 1 year, we will meet again on my country or in another countries in Africa, because I belong to all those lands. On 1 year, in the next COP, but you all know 1 year is not enough for a tree to grow, but it is enough time for trust to die. And trust is not like forest. When gone, it's never come back. So let's celebrate and let's implement all together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So at this stage, we're going to be joined by Dr. Hernandez. However, he seems to have not been able to make it yet. So we're just going to kind of move some things around, and hopefully he'll be able to join us soon. With that in mind, ooh, someone else in the waiting room. With that in mind, let us jump to the media kind of literacy activity portion, if you don't mind, Whitney. Thank you. Okay, so one of the kind of bigger kind of lesson plans in this packet involves students interacting with COP26 through a media literacy lesson plan. So through this lesson, students will be able to explain the role of Indigenous activists who attended and protested at the COP26 conferences, their demands, and the reasoning behind those demands. And students will be able to define and explain the role of media literacy in the contemporary world. Now, students do this in a kind of stepped process, for lack of a better term. So first, as a group, they interact with an infographic and learn about the context behind that infographic. And then they're guided in using the same questions that they use to interrogate the infographic on their own or in small groups, depending on kind of, you know, your personal preferred way of kind of organizing your own classroom. And students use these questions to interrogate various media articles surrounding COP26 and Indigenous activism around the conference itself. So let us go over to this infographic. Now, let's take a few minutes to kind of look at this and think about what this is telling us. So take about 30 seconds, think about this. What do you think this infographic is telling us in regards to COP26 delegations? Take about 30 seconds. I've just got an email from Dr. Hernandez, which I'm going to answer, and put your answers in the chat box. What is this infographic telling us about particularly fossil fuel industries and national delegations? 30 seconds or so. Wonderful, thank you. Excellent, some great thoughts in the chat box. Thank you very much for your thoughts, everyone. Oh, hello, Dr. Hernandez. I'm so glad you could join us. Apologies for the technical difficulties with Zoom. Oh, I'm afraid I can't hear you.
Hey, how about now?
Hey, there we go.
Hey. No, my apologies. I was having a little difficulties figuring out how to enter, but I figured it out.
No, thank you so much for joining us. Let us quickly pivot to your presentation, if that's all right with you. Excellent. So everyone, we're learning on the fly. I'm sure we all know how this is like. So that infographic, keep it in your mind because we're definitely going to come back to it. And the answers that you guys have been putting in the chat box are fantastic, and I can't wait to discuss them further. However, let me please give an introduction to Dr. Hernandez. Thank you very much for joining us. So Dr. Hernandez's research, filmmaking, and teaching examines just transitions to sustainability and regeneration. His focus is on social movements and eco-villages in Brazil and their construction of agroecological systems in emergent politics and worldviews. He also examines how social movement activity can be translated and implemented into social policy, and particularly interesting in the context of this workshop, may engage with the United Nations system. Thank you very much, Dr. Hernandez, for being here. I'll let you take it away.
Great. Is there a way I could share screen? I've got a little presentation here.
Yes, definitely. Let me make you co-host. Good, you should be all good to go.
Okay, thank you. Let me just see if I can do this without making a mess. Oh. There we go. Great. Can everyone see the construction of the UN there? Great. Well, I just want to thank Mary and Jasmine and Whitney for this opportunity to just engage a little bit kind of on a background of the United Nations, which I'm sure people know, is the framework for which the COP is taking place. And I guess my thesis here is a lot of what the COP can do and a lot of what the COP cannot do is kind of explained by maybe a more thorough understanding of the United Nations. And in a sense, what the United Nations can do and what the United Nations cannot do. And I want to apologize. I've got my wrong computer. So this is a earlier version of the presentation and it's missing one or two critical slides, but I can't remember which ones. So there might be a little jazz in the mix here. But so I'll just go ahead and jump right in if that's okay. Okay. Well, great. I guess I want to start that I think a lot of people and people who are quite politically suave may not have as a complete view of what the United Nations is and is not. And so I think that's kind of an interesting place to start. So here's a construction on the East River of the United Nations, and it kind of looks like it's been destroyed, but it's actually being constructed. So the end of the world has not happened yet. And the United Nations, let me check my slides here, yeah. So the United Nations is oftentimes confused as being some sort of global governance or global government, even worse. And it's really not. So just to start, I want to be able to say a little bit that, so I just recently moved to Albuquerque from New York City. And in New York, I was the chair of an international studies department, and we had a very strong United Nations program. And so that's why I feel I have some foundation to maybe talk about the UN today. And what's interesting is that the United Nations is, of course, in New York City, but the number of employees of the United Nations globally is a fraction of the number of employees of New York City. The total budget of the United Nations is a fraction, a small fraction, of the total budget of New York City. And so one might expect, our global government to actually have more employees and more money than New York City, but that's not the case. And I think that enters in a little bit about what the United Nations is and what it's not. And so I'll kind of foreshadow a little bit now. The United Nations is not an organization of governance. It's a membership organization. And it's a membership organization of 196 countries which come together. And so the United Nations as some sort of entity doesn't really exist in the way most of us most of the time think. It's really a space where 196 states come together. And I think that's the first big thing about the United Nations. But let's get a little more context. So the United Nations, many of the problems and successes of the UN are set up from the failure of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was set up after World War I and the historical trauma of World War I. And the idea that there had to be some sort of global forum to come together to keep peace. And it was initiated and founded and envisioned by, what's his face? I just ran out of class and I'm still in sustainability. Very important president, what's his face? Woodrow Wilson. The only PhD in US presidential history, interestingly enough. And you won a Nobel Prize for the envisioning of this. The United States Congress never signed on, so the US was never formally a member of the League of Nations. But World War II happened. And so the League of Nations failed. The League of Nations absolutely failed at its core project, which was to make sure there was never a world war again. And one of the key reasons it failed is that the structure was one nation, one vote. Now we can kind of look at this group and we see a lot of elderly white men. And that of course betrays the times that most of the world was someone else's colony. And so it was really Europe, the United States, and other kind of European outposts like New Zealand and Australia. But the flaw structurally was really one nation, one vote. And so once bigger, more powerful nations felt their interests were no longer being implemented, they left. And so without having the larger nations like Germany, for example, that the League of Nations lost any ability to actually do anything. And so after World War II, after World War II, the United Nations was founded. And in a sense, it was kind of the US New Deal writ large. And it was a coming together of just about every nation state at the time, and remembering at the end of World War II that much of the world was still somebody else's colony. One of the critical structural complications of the UN today is the Security Council. And I'm sure that many people know that the Security Council is really where decisions are made in the UN. And so the idea of the General Assembly, that's the democratic, huge meeting of the full number of members, is that any decision of the General Assembly has to be approved by the Security Council. The Security Council has 5 key members, and these are basically the victors of World War II. So the US, the UK, France, China, and Russia. And in a sense, it's horribly anti-democratic that any decision that is made has to go through these great powers. And of course, during the 20th century, what on earth could the United States and the Soviet Union agree on? Very little. And so not a lot would actually go through. And then today we can see it. What on earth can the United States and Russia and China agree on? Very, very little. The defense, and I'm not defending, but the defense of the Security Council is that it's, I've learned that in Albuquerque, there are very strong allergies in April. Thank you. Is that it was learning from the failure of the League of Nations. And so it was thought, if these so-called great powers after World War II did not really have a say in what was going on, the UN would fail. And today, there is still the 5 main veto powers, and then there's a rotating group of 10 who are voted in by the General Assembly. There have been different proposals about how maybe this basic concept could be expanded to better meet what the world looks like today, and have places like India and Brazil and Germany and Japan also with equal seats at the table with that veto power. But of course, any country that Russia wants, the US will veto. Any country the UK wants, China will veto. And so it kind of stays in a status quo, to perhaps the great detriment of the United Nations, because the structure of the United Nations is becoming increasingly divorced of the actual power structures on the ground. But I really want to just kind of emphasize that for me, that's not debilitating to what's interesting about the United Nations. And so for me to get to what's interesting about the United Nations, and I think has everything to do with the COPs, goes back to Dag Hammarskjöld, who is the second Secretary General of the UN. And he said, the United Nations will not get us to heaven, but they'll keep us out of hell. Because the reason the United Nations was made was to avoid World War III. And up until now, and it's being tested, as we speak, that has been successful in that main mission. Everything else the United Nations does is, in a sense, an adornment to keeping World War III from happening. So all the missile and nuclear treaties of the Cold War, the United Nations was oftentimes kind of the main place where that could happen. And the United Nations has had some, stunning victories in the 70 whatever years, 80 years. And things that maybe we banalize today, like the eradication of smallpox. That smallpox was one of the original kind of development missions of the United Nations. And so that the idea of development as a United Nations project was to keep world peace and to create a flourishing global democracy of flourishing nations would be a center for keeping World War III from happening. So smallpox was a scourge. Polio, to the extent it's been virtually eradicated, that the UN has everything to do with. My personal reason for thinking that the UN is a very relevant institution comes from this picture of the cafe in the general, in the headquarters off the East River. And what I learned in my 6 years kind of coming and going in the UN and being involved in quite a few things in the UN is that this is where things happen. So I first got involved with the UN at the height of the Syria crisis. And I had some mentors who were kind of showing me around. And these mentors, I'll talk about them in a second, were largely from India and Bangladesh and Pakistan. And they were talking and they'd point things out. Like over there, is some super underling of the United States mission to the UN. And some super underling, the secretary's undersecretary's cousin's dog sort of thing, of the Syrian mission and the US mission. And they would get together over coffee. And they would find, they would try to see if they could find any sorts of points of connection. And I remember well, one of my mentors, Rafi Ahmed, and he was kind of the right-hand man through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. He restructured the UN. He was responsible for the Cambodian peace accords. But he talked about the UN is really about diplomacy, that there's always one side can give something, and then the other side has to give something else. Rarely does it actually come to a full conclusion, but that's what the UN is about, is like getting a little bit closer. And so in the case of the Syria crisis, that these conversations that happened in the cafe would then make it up. And to the extent that Russia, the Assad governments, and the US government came to some conclusions, had to do with people talking in this cafe. And so one of the criticisms of the UN is it's just a talk shop. I think that can be reversed. That one of the great strengths of the UN is it might be one of the only places in the world that's permanently set up for people to actually talk to each other. And I was so delighted to learn that India and Pakistan, who of course, are always threatening of being on the verge of nuclear conflict, that the delegates on the ground in New York were all drinking buddies. And so it gives me hope that there's not going to be a nuclear conflict anytime too soon in South Asia. And because these folks through the UN system are in a sense keeping the peace. So as I said, I have the wrong computer. I guess I've got the wrong computer on the wrong day. And I skipped a bunch of slides. Let me jump ahead and remember what slide. Yeah, a whole bunch of slides. So pretend now that you are seeing a slide of Barack Obama and Premier Xi in China shaking hands at the Paris Accord. And so if we jump ahead a little bit, that the Paris Accord was able to do some things that previous accords could not. But to jump into the COPs, we have to jump back to the Earth Summit of 1992. And it was kind of heady days. The Cold War had just ended. And there was the idea that coming together to work around climate change would really unite the world. And I guess what those dreams have shown themselves to be a little more complicated. But in 1992, that was the idea. And George Bush Sr., at the Rio Earth Summit, really put out that the United States needed to be a leader in this, needed to be a leader of sustainable development. So very different times. And out of that came the COP process. And then later the Kyoto protocols, which in a sense failed. And then we finally get to the Paris Accord. And the Paris Accord was interesting. And it was because, in my opinion, and a lot of people's opinion, two main forms of diplomacy. One was the extraordinary diplomacy of the Obama administration and the Xi administration in China. Because in all previous climate talks, China and the US were always kind of balking and would never quite sign on. In Paris, they were the leaders. And so once the US and China were the leaders, then other countries knew, this is for real. And so that was kind of step one. And then step two was really an extraordinary new kind of diplomacy led by two fairly interesting people on the ground. And one is Cristiania, I always forget how to say her name, Figueres from Costa Rica. So my ancestral homes, I'm very proud. And that she comes from a political dynasty. That she was the daughter of Pepe Figueres, who led the Social Democratic Revolution in 1948 and established social democracy, not looking after the Soviet Union, but looking after Sweden in the late 40s in Costa Rica. And, and that's probably the main political reason why Costa Rica looks very different than some of its neighbors, was that, extraordinary moments of looking at the best of social democracy on the planet at the time, and then applying it to Central America. And this is also the government that at the very end of the Civil War, as things were coming to an end, got rid of the army. So, a very forward-looking moment. And so Cristiania is the daughter, and so comes from this Costa Rican political dynasty. And then, I'm just spacing on names today. I forget the name, Tom something Rivik, or Rivik something. Not hard to find if you want to look him up. An English fellow and very interesting guy. He'd been a Buddhist monk for 2 years in Thailand. And then interestingly, Cristiania, also a Buddhist of many, many years. And so they're kind of accredited of really developing a very new kind of diplomacy. And to see what's new about it, we can compare it to the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol was a great achievement, but it turned out to be politically unsustainable. And that the Kyoto Protocol came up with some rules, and some countries signed on and some didn't. And of course, the US never signed on. And then, of course, just dropped out with the election of George Bush Jr., George W. Bush. But it set common goals, pretty structured across all countries. So in the Paris Accord, it took a couple of years of coming up, but it was a phenomenal diplomacy of listening, of bridge building. And they just did a phenomenal job. And then with the leadership of the Chinese and the US governments, of getting everybody to the table, getting corporations, getting oil companies, getting NGOs, getting grassroots movements, everybody to the table. But part of it was flexibility. And so the idea would be, there'd be some common goals that would be decided upon, but each country would be flexible to figure out, to what extent, they would be able to do something and how they would do that. And I think the critique can be, well, it's a little bit toothless. Maybe the benefit is that the Paris Accord, in a sense, set a new conversation for the planet. And the second side of the Paris Accord is the sustainability agenda of 2030, of which the Sustainable Development Goals are kind of a key part. Now, I was hanging out in New York and I knew these were going to be coming out and I expected very little. And when they came out, I thought, these are extraordinary, that they're actually pretty amazing goals. Now, I don't know if people can see because we have all our heads kind of on the right hand, but if we move our heads a little bit, the first line and a half are really about people. And then on the third line, there's planet and then partnerships. So in a sense, the sustainable development goals, aren't quite as easy to get one's head around as, say, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But intellectually, conceptually, they are a very, very complete kind of interwoven 17 dimensions of sustainability. And so here's kind of my hope around these. And my hope is that because of the Paris Accord and because of the Sustainable Development Goals, that a new conversation has been set globally. And Bill McKinnon famously said that the Paris Accord will not save the world, but it saves the chance to save the world. And that it sets up a framework where that's actually possible. And so part of the idea of the flexibility was just to get everyone talking about the same thing. And the big question will be, can sustainable development, can these goals, can this narrative fulfill the same kind of global impact as some of these documents of the past, which of course never meet their full fruition. But we can go back to ancient Babylonia and oh my goodness, I'm just spacing things. Anyway, important, very old document. Let's skip over that. So we'll jump into the Western tradition, the Magna Carta, the translated from Latin to English, big ass letter. And this is when the aristocracy came and took the king and said, we're basically going to have a parliament. That didn't happen for a very long time. There's actually quite a period of reaction after that. But the Magna Carta set off kind of parts of modern democracy as we know it. The US Constitution, for better and for worse, is a document which has framed the modern world. The Declaration of Human Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it framed not only the United Nations, but it framed basically all political discourse from World War II until very recently. And whether countries were being kind of cynical with how they were mobilizing the terms of rights were the conversation. And so my hope is that the SDGs, and as COP moves forward, is able to set a kind of new vocabulary for how the world talks to each other, talks to itself. And that sustainable development, even if mobilized in more cynical ways, becomes the central talking point. And in a sense, we're right in that transition. And the next couple COPs and maybe some national elections, could change the direction of the world. But so I guess I'll end with this, that when we look at the COPs and what the COPs can and can't do, we're basically looking at the United Nations and what the United Nations can and cannot do. And so what the COPs can do is bring 196 countries together to try to come up with some sort of response at the scale of climate catastrophe. And they're inching closer, and there's some serious setbacks, but they're inching closer. And but it's really up to national governments, and particularly some of the more powerful national governments, to make that happen. That the UN and COP is the container, but COP doesn't exist in the same way the United Nations does not exist. The COP is a forum for conversation in which nation states are at the front. Now, I imagine the COPs will be much more successful the more and more other voices are kind of brought to the table, that organized civil society, indigenous voices, corporate voices, that there has to be a mass buy-in. But in the end, the COP process is led by nation states. And so it's really up to individual nation states to kind of really respond at the scale of the catastrophe. So I apologize again for running right from class with my incomplete presentation here. I couldn't get into Zoom. I don't even know why anyone's still here, but thank you so much. And I hope that this will be useful for you, as you're continuing to look at what are the possibilities of the COP. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hernandez. That was fascinating. And thank you so much for coming right after class. Thank you so much with your patience with the technical difficulties. This has been fascinating for me. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I feel like I have a deeper understanding of the United Nations system now. Way more so than I was able to gain just by reading things. I know it's late for you, but if you have time, perhaps to answer any questions that people may have, we'd be very grateful. If that's a possibility, but if not, of course, if you need to go, that's totally fine too.
No, of course, I'd be happy. And of course, conversation is always more interesting than answering any questions. So whatever conversation or comments or questions, I'd be thrilled to hear.
Wonderful. If anyone has any questions that they would like to ask Dr. Hernandez, please, that would be wonderful. Oh, and Maria, I see your comment in the chat box. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I have a question about, so in my class, we often look at the 2009 COP that was in Copenhagen, and before that there was an Indigenous Peoples Climate Summit, like to talk about issues to bring forth. And I'm just wondering kind of like the evolving response and participation of the UN with Indigenous peoples, and yeah, just any insight you have there.
Well, I'm pretty sure that there's probably other people here who might have a little more insight. Excuse me just for a second. Thank you. I don't think I have great insight into this, but as you know, 2009 in Copenhagen was really kind of seen as a bit of a failure. And exactly because not much could be agreed on. In terms of Indigenous voice, of course, there is far too little. And remembering that the UN is a nation state-based organization. And so I think the first thing that I would look at is that I think the UN is extremely important on that level. But if we're going to wait for the UN to be the only space, I don't think that's going to be enough. And so the failures of the UN on so many things, but let's take Indigenous voice, I think is partially because of the structure of the UN itself. And that, I'm glad to the extent that Indigenous voice has made it, and I'll mention a few things after about that, but then also the importance of having other nodes and other forums that are not the UN. And that though, and the UN is not the final word, that the UN, the power of the UN is to bring together states. Now that said, the administration of Kofi Annan, I can't remember when he started, but late 90s, I believe, that one of the big things he did was really, because up until Annan, the UN was really a state-based organization. That was it. There was really no other voices. So for example, Whitney has been working with an organization around immigration refugees. And when the UN is not shut down, are quite active in the General Assembly. But that's kind of new that organized society even has a space inside the UN. And so it was only in the late 90s that there started to be spaces for non-state actors. And I know that I had a friend who was working quite a bit with some of the first Indigenous summits. And there was a lot of confusion in the early years. Like, what exactly is the relationship then with states? Who's Indigenous and who's not? That ended up being actually something which really sidetracked a lot of kind of the early Indigenous participation in the UN, and until a more nuanced understanding of indigeneity, as a political concept versus, just an ethnic concept. And but these spaces are pretty new, and that maybe as Whitney could tell us a bit more about, because she's been right at the center of this, that the role of civil society, the role of organized society in the UN, of course, Whitney's organization, the different Indigenous forums, they don't have a vote. There's no teeth in the end. What they do have is being inside the conversation. So some of the best civil society work that I've seen is organizations who are able to bring countries together around issues that are important to them, and then start to make things happen at that political level. Now, that said, I guess I'm just repeating myself at this point, that the UN, at this point, isn't all that deft at bringing in these other voices, but it's much more than it was 20 years ago. And so I really see the importance of having many different global nodes, which are maybe interacting, counteracting, and making sure these voices, have agency, at this global level. I hope that's somewhat useful, but I'd be curious of what you've been doing in your classes. And that was back to you, Holly.
Every year when I'm teaching about climate, it kind of evolves and I add more stuff and I never have enough time. But I do a lesson where students are in like groups that represent like about 6 of the different Indigenous groups that were at that summit. And we like read the same intro that was read there, and they kind of look at what issues their group is facing, and then they meet with someone in each of the other groups, and then they come up with, well, what would their demands be to the UN? And then we like come up with a whole class group list of those, and then we compare them to what the list that was created. And oftentimes there are some key similarities, and there are several things, of course, that the students didn't think of, but are good talking points. And then we talk about what happened. Several years ago when I would do this, kids would be like shocked that like none of this got passed. And my students this year were like, yeah, of course that didn't. Like, they were like, if it did, it wouldn't, like, things would be a lot different now. Which I hadn't had that response before, but I mean, that was very insightful and right. But yeah, I mean, students these days just know so much more. Like, it's not an issue of, I'm not teaching like climate change is happening, let me prove this to you. Like, it's not like, we go over the science, yes, so that they're able to talk about it. But yeah, it just looks a lot different teaching students these days. So always kind of looking to update and new stuff in the classroom. And thank you so much. I feel like I don't have the deepest understanding of the UN, so this was really helpful.
I'm so happy, thanks. Whitney, would you be willing to share a little bit about kind of your view of the possibilities and limitations of organized society in the UN, even though the UN's been kind of shut down since you've been there?
Yeah, CIMN, I would say, is unique because it's an on-the-ground organization. So they have casas all over the world where refugees and immigrants are able to access different types of services. So it can be services related to health, education, basic necessities being met. They have a really amazing jobs program where they help refugees and immigrants fill out the paperwork and then place them in jobs. And they do sort of like check-ins with them to see if it's meeting the immigrant or refugees' expectations. They also have another jobs program where they provide a small loan and they're able to start their own business in the community. And then if I think they're able to keep it open for a certain number of years, there's a loan forgiveness option. So the types, I work in the more administrative lens because it's the New York based office instead of being out of, the one in Brazil, but we deal more with reporting. So each casa has to report to the headquarters office so that we can then provide data to our funders. We're sort of trying to like sell, for lack of a better word, or at least make more tangible the experiences of immigrants and refugees on the ground. And I think that's one of the hard parts is the disconnect, quite frankly. Like, the jobs that we're engaging in from a more administrative level, you lose the personal aspect. So we've been trying to create a more qualitative reporting process for people working at the CASAs around the world. But I think another thing that's really interesting about CIMN is that one of the drawbacks is that you are beholden as a nonprofit organization to your funders. So their goals can be very different from what the actual needs are for a certain community. So that's definitely a tension that exists. But at the same time, not having, I think another, I don't know if I would call it a drawback, but maybe both a strength and a weakness is that as a nonprofit organization or non-governmental organization, you have to foster relationships with the nation that you're in. So that's a little bit of extra legwork that's required. And at the same time, it means that you get to represent different people. You're not necessarily beholden to the same sort of politics that someone might be if they're in the government. So that's something as well. Yeah, I mean, I think any sort of international cooperation is challenging because there's so many different stakeholders. But I do find CIMN to be one of the more impressive sort of immigrant and refugee centered organizations that I've been involved in.
It sounds like COVID might have changed some things. I know some administrative changes have kind of focused more on the CASAs, but historically CIMN has also worked a lot within the General Assembly. And was really important in getting critical language in the Global Compact of Migration, the Global Compact around refugees. And these are the documents which more or less are conditioning, what migration and refugees are going to look like, what migration and refugee policy globally is going to look like the next 20, 30 years. And so I think that's the sort of thing that organized society, indigenous groups can really work with nation states and, nation states who are sympathetic to the causes and want to be brought together to get language in. So for example, in the Sustainable Development Goals, there was this kind of this united front of religious organizations who really made sure in the SDGs that water was a right. And it seems like a small thing, but getting water as a right, getting that language in the SDGs, of course, has enormous implications, and then how the SDGs are wielded until 2030. And so that, I think, is where non-state actors, is where they can act, but it's also the limitation. And frankly, I think we're, now and again, the geography of the global system transforms. And the last great transformation of that maybe was 1989, but really, 1945, where the European colonial order gave way to the US liberal order and a world of nation states. And in my view, and this is, my view, and I'm sure some other people's views, but, we're kind of at the tipping point, and that probably the political geography is going to transform as radically again. If I was going to place my bets, ready for this? Tell me in 30 years if I was right. If I was going to place my bets that we're going to go more towards a regional global order, where things that look like the European Union or the UNASUR, the United Nations of South America, the Arab League, that I think these regional blocks are going to become the major political containers. And so a lot of the problems in the UN is it's really stressing the end of perhaps this nation state order, and that nation states, just as, this order is not able to take on the demands that we face, demands in terms of conflict, demands in terms of climate. So I think that's another thing in thinking about what the UN can and can't do, is that we might be at the end of a political geography that's going to change. So any further comments, Rotten Tomatoes, questions? I didn't realize we're such a small group. I came in and just saw on the side there. It wouldn't have been quite so formal.
No, it's a quite like small, intimate group. We've had to change some things around. But in its own way, having a small group is wonderful. I have a follow-up question if no one else. does, although I'm technically one of the hosts, so I definitely don't want to like take the floor with my question if other people have questions.
Well, I saw that Maria appeared and disappeared. I don't know if that was a mistake or if you'd meant to appear.
Okay, let's try our very best. On working with indigenous people. Are we okay?
You're hearing more or less, but I think we got you.
Okay. On working with indigenous. Let me type it. On working with indigenous people, it appears that they need to have a very specific language. So we need more people that can translate their needs in the United Nations. So we need a stronger support of people that can communicate needs with United Nations. How do we create that strong format that can support the needs of the 90% of the population that are left outside of the United Nations, that need specifically every single item that you mentioned, right? All those goals, 90% of the population need that. So as ambassadors, right? Everyone that is here, we need to create better ways to communicate the needs with leadership. So then we can make a difference in this world. Otherwise, we're gonna continue with the, it's not that I'm, it's that eventually you become cynical and you don't wanna do anymore because you're exhausted. So they need, when we're presenting to the students, we need to have better communication because that's, basically what we're lacking here. And someone else is deciding for the rest of the world what needs to happen, but United Nations is like limited in how much you can have. Okay. Right.
I'm so sorry. We just lost your last 10 seconds. Could you tell us again your last 10 seconds?
I'm in an adobe house and you can see my modem. So I'm working on it. Hear me? Okay.
I'm so sorry. Was anyone able to catch that last sentence? I really want to know. Would you be able to type for us?
How do we create better communicators?
Okay.
That can share the needs of 90% of the population in the United Nations organization.
Okay, I think we got that.
Okay.
Well, I've got my own response to that, but yeah, okay, great. I've got my own response, but I've got a sense that none of us just fell off the turnip truck. That we're well aware that nation states are built around historical power structures, and so if we're expecting 196 nation states to come up, oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, if we're expecting 196 nation states who are all compromised in their own ways in terms of power and money and all the ways that I don't think we have to go into great detail, and we're expecting the utopia to come from that, we might be waiting for a while. And so when we're looking at the limitations of the United Nations, we're also looking at the limitations of modern governance, modern democracy, the power of money, the power of global corporations, that we know that the biggest corporations are more, have larger incomes than the GDPs of most countries on the planet. And so all this kind of gets that limit of the nation state. Now, that said, my response was maybe a little political, but one of my favorite organizations on the planet, and I'll bet some of us know this, is the world's largest social movement, Via Campesina, the Peasant Way. And it's 200 some organizations of landless workers, rural workers, and small farmers who come together around this global node. And what's incredible about them is that they're absolutely based in practice of small and landless farmers around the planet who are very creatively figuring out ways, to have livelihoods and to make political space in the countryside. But then they come together at this global level and quite a bit in the UN around Via Campesina. And one of the things that Via Campesina has been able to do at the UN is absolutely shift the narrative around food. So in the late 90s, the narrative around food was very neoliberal, it was very market oriented. And the big term was food security. And so that people need to have secure accesses to food. Now that might be McDonald's and it might be a syringe full of vitamins, but it's still very much this market-based idea of food. And for people who are interested in food, that we know that there's much more food on the planet than is necessary, but the food is poorly distributed because of gross inequalities around the planet, and that the people who don't have access to food is largely around the world because they don't have money. So it's really an issue more of democracy. It's an issue of power. And but what Via Campesina has been able to do is shift that to where now on equal footing, at these global conversations, is the concept of food sovereignty, which is really, and I'm sure people are somewhat familiar with that or very familiar with that, but which is really about the democratization of the food system and the delinking from agribusiness and blah, blah, blah. And so I think getting to Maria's kind of comments and I think it's an open question always for all of us, but I see that she wrote grassroots movements, and I would just completely agree with that. But in what ways can grassroots movements effectively come together at a global level and create, new stories? And so in the sense that in the case of Via Campesina, they've created a new story from the future of agriculture is big, efficient petrochemical agribusiness, which is going to feed the world, to a future of smallholders who could create agroecological systems and livelihoods. And, of course, it's not like the UN is fully on board with that, because the UN is a wildly diverse organization, but they've changed the conversation. They're changing the story. And so I think there's the two parts. That there's, of course, the grassroots movements, but there's the grassroots movements coming together effectively and really creating other stories, and then bringing those stories to the governments in the UN who are ready to listen. That, frankly, Via Campesina, their first stop was not the United States. Their first stop was Bolivia. Their first stop was, where else? A lot of African nations, Tanzania and Malawi. And those were their first stops, to get countries who got what they're saying and it made political sense for them. And then started to build kind of the coalition of the willing to start moving things in that direction at the UN. And so, unfortunately, I'm sure all of us probably know more about the ins and outs of Indigenous activism at the UN. And so I'm really the wrong person to speak on this, but I think we can learn from some of the effective rural movements, that in what ways can Indigenous movements come together, and I know there's lots of forums at the global level, create some sort of unified voice among that diversity, that one world where many worlds are possible, that kind of creates this other direction where things can go. And probably, that these global Indigenous consortiums, federations, their first stop is not going to be the United States. Their first stop is going to be places like Bolivia, or maybe today in Chile, and governments that are going to have an ear. And then working with those governments start to get things through. Now, I probably overstated the case in the terms of the UN, because of course the UN does do a lot. There's the United Nations Development Program. There's the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization. There's UNICEF. There's all sorts of agencies which do things. And with the support of some mission countries, that can really change the way that these agencies do things within the UN. But in the end, it comes down to power. And and grassroots organizations know this better than most about how to construct real power. So how to construct real power at the global level. It's probably this mixture between having one foot on the ground in practice and then translating that into a new narrative or new stories that can start to shift the story at the global level. Because the story at the global level is a very market-dominated story, and human life is more interesting than just that. So Maria, I hope that that's interesting, but I think that you already knew the answer, but I appreciate you bringing up the question for us.
Well, thank you very much. That was immensely comprehensive. Thank you so much for saying on this. That was fascinating.
It's another way to say long-winded. I've heard that before.
No, but it's super fascinating, and I feel this is the first time I've really kind of started to grasp like the story of the UN, because it's something that even as we were working to put these resources together, you kind of come across like the bureaucracy of it it's quite the first thing you kind of hit, and at points I felt like I was running through kind of an empty building, kind of screaming, looking for the humans. But in the way you've described it and the way you've told the story, it's the humanness of it, of the organization, and the potential of it is very visible, or much more visible to me now. So thank you. That was invaluable. I we all really appreciate it. Are there any further questions before I kind of move us along? So we are kind of quite a small group. And I know we are getting towards the kind of official ending time. And it's a Thursday, and life continues to cavalcade on for all of us. So I want to ask kind of what would most serve everyone who is here. We started to kind of look at the final lesson plan that we put together. We can definitely cavalcade on with that. Or I'm also very happy to kind of share some kind of links with everyone of where the lesson plans are. We have the LAII Need Your Help. So I'm very happy to be guided at this stage by kind of what would best serve everyone who is here. Would you like to go through a lesson plan? Or would you like to do that in your own time, and we just I kind of wrap things up with the final stuff that we wanted to share? Feel free to unmute yourself or put stuff in the or put stuff in the chat box. Okay, Maria says own time. Yeah, I see a general kind of a thumb up from Holly. Okay, awesome. We will cavalcade own time. Okay, fabulous. So this is Whitney. Could you do me a favor? And wow, that's really, I feel like I'm traveling through hyperspace. Thank you, Whitney. Couple things. The LAII Need Your Help. I used to teach in the classroom. I haven't taught in the classroom for the last year or so. And undoubtedly the last year has really been a time. And so we would love your input on how we can best serve you. Because it's really, undoubtedly kind of things have changed, and my perception of how things were a year ago perhaps don't serve you right now. So if you're able, we would love kind of you to join the LAII Teacher Advisory Council. I'm going to put this link in the chat box. Oh yes, and thank you, Jasmine, for answering that question. Yes, I'm going to send through a copy of the presentation, all being well. later on this evening. So you'll get a copy of the PowerPoint, as well as links to the resources themselves. We will also be putting the presentation up on the LAII website. That's going to take us a little bit more time though. That won't happen this evening. That would be a bit too quick, but that will come along soon. But you will be getting a presentation later on this evening. The link to the advisory council form is in the chat box. We would love your input. I really cannot stress that enough. We are going to be starting our planning process for the next school year over the summer. And so at some point over the summer, we will meet with the Teacher Advisory Council, virtually in-person, hybrid. We're still working that out to kind of get the input on how we can best serve serve you guys in the year to come. Could I have the next slide, please, Whitney? Thank you. In that kind of same vein, we have a form, if you don't mind kind of letting us know, how it went. General questions, both on kind of the resources themselves and this workshop. And finally, the most important thing, a link to where the resources themselves are. And that webpage will be updated with the PowerPoint and the recording as well in the days to come. I believe that is everything on my end. I'm going to put my email into the chat box as well. You do have the LAI outreach email. That's the one you use to sign up. If you would like to contact me directly, if you have any kind of feedback you would like to share, or questions you have, or, perhaps you go home and later on this evening, a question percolates and you're like, oh man, I should have asked that. Feel free to email me. And I'll be happy to help out. Now, all that being said, any questions, comments, anything at all? Thank you so much for being here. It really means a lot. Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much for your questions and your comments. Thank you, Holly. And thank you, Rita. It's been wonderful to have you all here. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us on a random Thursday afternoon. And thank you very much, Dr. Hernandez. We really appreciate your time and your wonderful presentation. And thank you so much for bringing kind of the human side to the UN and helping us all understand that. Really, really appreciate it.
I just want to say it was nice to meet you, Holly and Maria, and I'm sure Rita is very nice as well, although I didn't get to hear her. But thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much. Take care. Have a wonderful evening. Oh, sorry, Jasmine.
Oh, I was just going to say thanks to everyone. It was a fun group. And thanks to Dr. Hernandez for enlightening us on the UN.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care, stay safe, best of luck for the end of the school year, and we'll see each other soon. Thank you. Bye.